The candles were always the last thing I did before anyone arrived. I moved through the studio the way I always moved through it in those final 20 minutes, adjusting the ivory pillar on the windowsill, tilting the amber glass 1-2 inches to the left, stepping back to check that what I saw matched the version I'd already built in my head. The late afternoon light came through the linen curtains exactly right, soft, diffuse, the kind of light that made everything look like it had never been touched by anything difficult. I took out my phone and shot 3 test frames of the corner shelf. Rearranged the dried pampas, the small framed print, the white ceramic vase. Shot 3 more. The vase went back to where it had started. Daniel was at the folding table behind me, the one I used for client paperwork. I could hear him typing, then pausing, then typing again, the rhythm of someone working through something that kept asking for more than expected. He'd been like that most of the afternoon. Quiet. Positioned just outside whatever I was composing. "Does the ring light need charging before tomorrow?" I asked, without turning around. "I did it this morning." "And Mrs. Harmon?" "The consultation." "Confirmed. It's in the calendar." I moved the vase again. Moved it back. The shelf looked the same either way, and I knew that, but I kept my hands busy with it because the alternative was standing still and listening to the particular quality of his silence, the way it had weight to it lately, a density I didn't want to press on. "He's tired. He gets like this. He'll be fine." My phone buzzed on the shelf. "Mom, coming tonight with Ryan and Chloe. Around 7. Have something to discuss." I read it twice. Set the phone face down. Straighten the pampas, which didn't need straightening. Behind me, the typing stopped. I didn't turn around. My mother arrived 12 minutes early, which was how she arrived everywhere, not because she miscalculated, but because early was its own kind of control. She stood in the doorway and looked at the studio the way she looked at things she was already deciding about. Then she walked through slowly, touching the edge of the work table, glancing up at the track lighting, nodding at the equipment cabinet with a familiarity she hadn't earned. "It's very you," she said. Not quite a compliment. Not quite not one. Ryan came in behind her looking at his phone. Chloe was studying the lighting rig with an expression I recognized from the one time she'd looked at my apartment before I redecorated it, assessing square footage, calculating potential. I'd set the table with the good plates. The cloth napkins. The water glasses that caught candlelight and threw small warm circles on the ceiling. My mother talked the way she always talked about hard things, smoothly, with the patient confidence of someone waiting for the room to catch up to a conclusion she'd already reached. Ryan's rental space. A dispute with the landlord over a late payment that wasn't, according to my mother, his fault. Chloe's client list outgrowing her home setup. 2 people who needed something real, something professional, somewhere that would let them grow into what they were supposed to become. "You've built that here," my mother said, looking around the studio with a warmth that included everything in it except Daniel. "It would be a shame for it to sit half empty when your brother is struggling." The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone understood was a decision, not a question. I reached for my water glass. My fingers closed around it and I didn't lift it. Across the table, Daniel had stopped eating. He wasn't looking at my mother. He was looking at me steadily, without urgency, the way you look at something you've been watching for a long time and are finally letting yourself see clearly. I looked down at my plate. "Mom is probably just thinking out loud," I said. My voice came out softer than I intended. "She only wants to help." Daniel set his fork down. Didn't pick it up again. He didn't say another word for the rest of the meal, and neither did I, and I told myself that was the same thing. I found him in the kitchen later, glass of water in hand, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Not angry. Daniel rarely looked angry. He looked the way he sometimes looked when he was reading a contract, careful, already a few steps ahead, deciding something quietly. "She just worries about Ryan," I said. "You know how she gets." "Do you know who's on the lease for the studio?" I blinked. "What?" "The studio lease. The monthly agreement. Do you know whose name is on it?" I opened my mouth. The answer I needed wasn't there. I'd always assumed it was a shared thing, one of those details that got handled in the early weeks when we were both excited, and I was busy sourcing curtain fabric, and he was busy doing the parts I'd never fully looked at. There's also the equipment insurance, he said, in the same voice. The website hosting. The booking software. The accountant who handles your business taxes. The standing order for the lighting rig service contract. He wasn't reading from a list, he had it memorized. I'm not telling you this so you'll thank me. I'm telling you because you said you didn't know. I'm asking if that's actually true. Something shifted in my chest. Not guilt, not yet. Something more like the feeling of reaching for a step in the dark and finding the floor 6 inches lower than expected. You're so good at those things, I said. I didn't want to interfere. He nodded the way he nodded when he'd been given an answer he already knew was coming. I called Chloe the next morning from the kitchen while the studio sat quiet behind the glass. He's being rigid about the whole thing, I said. No one is forcing anyone. It was just a conversation. Chloe made sympathetic sounds. She said Daniel was probably stressed about something unrelated and projecting. She said to give him a day or two, that he'd handled everything so smoothly for so long, he'd come around. He's always been so capable, she said. He'll figure it out. I made tea and didn't drink it. Looked at the studio from the kitchen window, the curtains I'd sourced, the awning Daniel had installed in March after I mentioned, twice, that the south-facing glare was ruining my afternoon footage. He'll understand. He always understands these things. I set the mug on the counter and opened Instagram instead. The first email arrived on a Tuesday while I was editing. Your scheduling software subscription has been canceled. Access will end in 48 hours. I assumed a billing glitch. I clicked through to the account settings and found the payment card removed, a card I didn't recognize, listed under the name D. Whitmore. I tried my own login. It didn't work. I called the software company and waited on hold long enough to reorganize my prop shelf before a representative informed me the account had been closed by the account holder and I wasn't listed as an authorized user. By Thursday, I had found 4 more. The website hosting, his name, his card. The equipment insurance policy, sole policyholder, D. Whitmore. The studio lease, which I had signed, listed him as financial guarantor, meaning my signature was decorative without his backing. The booking calendar I used for every client consultation, account registered to an email address I didn't have the password for. I sat in the studio with my phone and tried to figure out which number to call first to stop this, and couldn't find a single service where my name appeared in a place that mattered. My mother called before I found one. You need to speak to Daniel, she said. Her voice had its reasonable quality, the one that made unreasonable things sound like simple logistics. This is a performance. He's embarrassed because someone told him the truth and now he's punishing everyone for it. Mom, I don't think. Ryan is watching his window close. Every day. And Daniel is sitting on a space he barely uses, acting as though being asked to share it is some great injustice. She paused. You know how to talk to him, Claire. You've always been the one who knows how. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm. Once, then again. When I was 13, there was an evening in the kitchen when I'd said something small and true in the direction of my father, who was being lectured about something I couldn't remember now. What I remembered was my mother going elsewhere inside herself, not leaving the room, not raising her voice, just withdrawing behind her own eyes, and taking the warmth of the house with her. For 3 days the rooms felt pressurized. I moved through them carefully, the way you move through a space where something fragile is stored. On the 4th morning I apologized. I wasn't sure what for. She'd pulled me close and said, "You're the one who always understands, sweetheart." I'll talk to him, I told her. I hung up, looked at the studio. The lighting rig Daniel had mounted in March. The equipment cabinet whose contents I had never inventoried. The folder he'd left on the edge of the work table 3 days ago that I had moved twice without opening. I picked up my phone. Put it down. I did not open the folder. Not yet. I opened it on Friday evening alone after I'd run out of ways to not. I told myself I needed to understand the situation. I needed facts before I could have any useful conversation with anyone. I was being practical. The lease was on top. Studio rental, monthly payment, guarantor signature line. D. Whitmore, with a date from 3 years ago and 2 renewal signatures after that. Each one his handwriting. None of them mine. Below it, itemized equipment purchases. The camera body and lenses. The lighting rig complete. The computer I edited on every day. The external hard drives, 4 of them, where 3 years of client footage lived. The wireless microphone set. The collapsible backdrop system I'd picked out from a catalog and left open on the kitchen table for him to find. A credit card I had never held. Below that, web developer invoices marked paid. Accounting fees for 3 consecutive years. A printed spreadsheet of my business income and expenses, annotated in his handwriting with notes I didn't understand, tax category references, depreciation schedules. Things I had never been asked to look at because I had never asked to look at them. And at the bottom, a bank statement. 3 years of monthly transfers, highlighted in yellow, to a credit card I used for props, flowers, candles, backdrop materials, the small things that made the studio look like what I told people it was. The transfers came from an account in his name alone. I put the last page on the table. The studio was very quiet. Outside, a car moved down the street. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. I thought about the post I'd put up 8 months ago, this room. The afternoon light exactly right, the caption I'd written at midnight because I wanted it to sound like I'd thought of it naturally. Built this from scratch. Still can't believe it's mine. 47,000 likes. I looked at my hands flat on the table. They looked the same as they always had. I was 13, standing in the kitchen doorway watching my mother wash dishes with her back to the room. I had said something I could no longer remember what, only that it had felt small and survivable when it left my mouth. She hadn't turned around. She'd kept washing, slow and deliberate, and the silence had moved through the house like a drop in pressure, the kind you feel in your ears. 3 days. I had apologized on the 4th morning without knowing what I was apologizing for. She'd held me against her shoulder and said I was the one who understood. What I'd learned, love was a thing that could be withheld. The way to keep it was to not be the reason anyone had to make that choice. I left the folder on the table. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call my mother. I sat in the consultation chair by the window, the good chair, the one I used to make clients feel at ease, and looked at the studio I had told 47,000 people I had built from scratch. The room was beautiful. The light was exactly what I'd always wanted. I sat in it for a long time without fixing anything. The movers arrived at 9. 2 men with a cart, a clipboard, very polite. I stood against the far wall and watched them work. They started with the lighting rig for ceiling-mounted fixtures I'd spent weeks choosing, the positioning of which I had adjusted by ½ degrees until the fill light sat exactly where I needed it for client portraits. It took an Allen key and about 6 minutes per fixture. The soft, calibrated glow went out in stages, fill light, kicker, both rims. When the overhead fluorescence came on fully, the room looked smaller. The walls were a shade of off-white I had never noticed before. They took the camera equipment in padded cases. The computer. The drives. The microphones. They moved carefully and without commentary, which was its own kind of consideration I was in no position to appreciate. When they finished, the studio held my desk, my chair, a shelf of props, the curtains, the rug. I was standing inside what I actually owned. My mother arrived before the van pulled away. She stood in the doorway and took in the half-empty room, and her face moved through something, grief, maybe, or the calculation of what this meant for Ryan, before settling into composure. "He's making a point," she said. "This is theater." Ryan was behind her. He looked at the bare ceiling tracks and said, quietly, "There's not going to be enough room for a cutting table." Chloe's voice came from his phone on speaker while he held it slightly away from his body. "Claire, I told you weeks ago that you needed to get out in front of this. Why didn't you just talk to him when there was still time?" I looked at the 4 small holes in the ceiling where the mounting screws had been. Round and clean and evenly spaced. "He's never respected this family," my mother said. The words moved through me the same way they always had, not landing so much as sliding into a groove already worn for them, a groove I'd spent most of my life making smooth. I opened my mouth. I closed it. I looked at the holes in the ceiling and I said nothing, and outside the van doors closed, and that was the sound of everything I had called mine being driven away. I asked to meet him at the coffee shop 2 blocks from the studio. Neutral ground. A public place with ambient noise that could carry the awkward parts away before they settled. He was already there when I arrived, coffee he'd barely touched, the particular stillness of someone who has already made his decisions and is no longer arguing with them. I sat down across from him, and I had the words ready. I'd practiced in the car, quietly, to myself, trying to find the version that was real and not strategic. I went through the folder, I said. All of it. I understand now what you've been carrying. I paused. I should have asked. I should have looked at it years ago, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. He watched me say this. I'm not asking you to fix anything, I said. I just needed you to know that I actually see it now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, When do you cry, Claire? I blinked. What? Not just today. In general. When does it happen for you? I didn't know how to answer that. I looked at my hands around my coffee cup. I was wearing my rings. I didn't know why I'd put them on. You're not crying right now because I was invisible, he said. His voice was even, without accusation, which was almost worse. You're crying because the studio is gone and your mother is upset and your brother can't open his business in a space he was never entitled to, and you want someone to make the feeling stop. That's what this is. That's not fair. I'm not trying to be unfair. He looked at me steadily. I know you didn't mean for any of it to happen this way. I've always known that. But Claire, that's not actually the problem. That was never the problem. I wanted to reach across the table and pull out the part of me that was genuinely sorry, the part that had sat in the consultation chair on Friday night and felt something crack open, and hold it up and make him see it. But I could hear the shape of my own apology from the outside now, the way you suddenly hear a song's chord structure once someone points it out, and the shape had an end to it. The end was him deciding to stay. He received the separation papers 3 days later. I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Long enough to reach for my phone twice. Both times I put it down. I sat in the kitchen of the apartment we had shared for 3 years, the kitchen where he'd made coffee every morning, where he'd sat with the laptop doing things I'd never asked about, and I held the papers, and I didn't call my mother. It was the first time I hadn't. The final walkthrough was my mother's idea. She called it a practical matter. Items of disputed ownership, she said, needed to be inventoried before the lease terminated. Ryan had spoken to someone with a legal background. There might be grounds, she said, to contest the removal of assets purchased during the marriage. She used the word grounds with the certainty of someone who had looked it up and decided it applied. Daniel was already at the studio when we arrived. He stood by the window with a folder and no particular expression. He'd been like that the whole time, no performance, no cruelty. Just a man with paperwork and a clear account of what belonged to him. My mother began the way she always began hard conversations, not with heat, but with reasonableness. The assets had been purchased during the marriage, she said. There were arguments to be made. She wasn't suggesting anything unreasonable. She was simply asking for a conversation before things became final, because surely after 3 years some consideration was owed to all of them. The receipts have my name, Daniel said. The card statements have my name. The guarantee on the lease has my name. There's nothing to contest. You're being deliberately obstructive. I'm being accurate. She turned to me. The pivot was smooth, practiced, the natural rotation of someone who has always known which way the room tilts. Claire, she said. Tell him. And I felt it, the old mechanism, the groove, the almost physical pull toward the words that would make the room's temperature rise back to something livable. Daniel, maybe we can just sit down. Daniel, I think what Mom is trying to say. The words were right there. They had been right there for the entirety of my adult life. I thought about a kitchen, dishes, 3 days of silence. I thought about 47,000 people being told I built something from scratch. I thought about Daniel at the folding table, behind me, while I adjusted a candle. Mom, I said. She looked at me. What you asked him to do was wrong. My voice was quieter than I wanted it to be, but it was mine, and it didn't stop. You walked into his studio, into something he built and paid for and maintained for 3 years, and you told him to hand it over like it was a family heirloom you were redistributing. You spoke to him like he was in the way. I stopped, breathed, and I sat there and let you do it. So I was wrong too. The room held still. My mother's face did what it had always done, not anger, not noise. The slow, precise withdrawal. The temperature dropping. The air thinning. I felt every degree of it. I had always felt every degree of it. The reflex was right there. I didn't mean it. I'm sorry. That came out wrong. Let's just, and I stood in it, and I didn't say any of those things. Across the room, Daniel was watching me. Not with warmth. Not with the relief I'd half hoped for. Just with recognition. The look of someone who had waited a long time to see something and was now, finally, seeing it without being surprised. He didn't move toward me. I hadn't expected him to. Ryan said something. I said his name, once, and he stopped. Chloe looked at her phone. My mother stood at the center of the room and said nothing, which was the loudest she had ever been. I signed the papers on a Wednesday. The lawyer's office was carpeted and climate-controlled, designed to make everything feel orderly, and I sat across from a woman with reading glasses and a careful voice who told me I could take all the time I needed. I read each page. I initialed where required. I did not contest the equipment. I did not make a claim on the studio infrastructure. I did not ask for support payments. I signed my full name 3 times and slid the folder back across the desk and said I was ready. She said the copies would be mailed within 10 business days. I said thank you. I left. The room I was renting was on the 3rd floor of a building in a neighborhood I was still learning. My landlord had painted the walls beige and installed a ceiling fixture with a cool, flat bulb that flattened everything it touched. I'd bought a second-hand lamp from a shop around the corner, warm bulb, the right temperature, and set it in the corner by the window. I'd stood looking at it for a while after I plugged it in. I'd moved it once. Then I left it where it was. I hadn't unpacked the candles. They were still in the box by the door, wrapped in the same paper I'd packed them in, which meant they smelled like the old studio, bergamot, a little cedar, the particular warmth of a room that had been carefully managed. I didn't know yet what to do with that smell. Whether to light them and let it go, or wait until I couldn't remember what I was grieving. The studio was gone. My mother had not called since the walkthrough, which was its own kind of answer to a question I hadn't let myself ask out loud. Ryan had texted once, "Hey, you okay?" And I'd responded yes and left it there. I sat on the edge of the bed in the afternoon light, which came through a window that overlooked a fire escape, which overlooked the gray wall of the building next door. No southern exposure. No linen curtains. No calibrated fill. I deleted the pinned post. The one from the first week, me with the studio keys, the good light, the caption I'd workshopped until it sounded offhand. Built this from scratch. Still can't believe it's mine. I didn't put anything in its place. In the morning, I was going to call a bookkeeper. I had a name on a piece of paper, someone a colleague had recommended, a woman who worked with small creative businesses. I was going to sit down with her and go through what existed in my name, what I actually owned, what I actually owed, with no assumption that any of it had already been handled. I was going to learn the number. But it was not morning yet, and I was sitting in the beige room with the second-hand lamp and the box of unlit candles by the door, and my phone was face down on the bed beside me, and there was no particular light to adjust, and nothing that needed to look like anything. I breathed in. I breathed out. For the first time in longer than I could calculate, I was not performing stillness. I was just still.